For many years, Iran has defined itself in part by its opposition to my country. And there is, in fact, a tumultuous history between us.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Relations between Iran and the United States have been mostly adversarial since the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Here was not an embassy. It was a CIA center. This was a den of espionage, where they were plotting against the Iranian people.
But the seeds of animosity between the two countries were planted decades before. In 1952, Time magazine chose Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, as the 1951 Man of the Year for his efforts to nationalize his country's oil wealth despite mounting economic pressure from Britain. Mossadegh was Iran's 35th Prime Minister, but his government succeeded in doing what no other Iranian leader was able to do before. He went against British interests in his country and deprived the Navy from securing oil supplies. To understand how important this chapter is in Iran's history and how it shaped its future and its relations with the US, we have to go back to the start of the century, when Iran was still known as Persia. Like many states in the region, Iranian oil wealth was monitored by foreign countries since its discovery. In 1901, the British government encouraged entrepreneur William Knox D'Arcy to invest in Persia's oil sector. The British brokered a deal between D'Arcy and the then Shah of Iran, Muzaffar al-Din. D'Arcy was granted a 60-year concession to prospect, transport, and sell petroleum, natural gas, asphalt, and minerals in 3/4 of the country. Under the deal, the Shah was given a lump sum of £20,000 in cash and a further £20,000 in shares, with Iran set to receive only 16% of the profits. The D'Arcy Agreement is known historically as the deal that compromised Iran's ability to benefit from its own oil wealth for decades. In 1908, a significant oil reserve was found at Masjid Soleimani in southwestern Iran. It was the world's largest oil discovery at the time, and it set off a wave of exploration that would change the region's future. After the discovery, the British government bought out the D'Arcy concession and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company that later became the British Petroleum Company, or BP, in 1954. In the coming era, navies and national economies would be powered by oil, replacing coal. Iranian oil helped the British Navy substantially during World War I. Winston Churchill, who secured the purchase of the shares from the D'Arcy concession, affirmed the importance of Iranian oil.
Fortune brought us a prize from fairyland beyond our wildest dreams.
For the next 50 years, Iran's vast oil reserves came under British control. That is, until Mossadegh came into power. After World War II, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's rule was weakened by the rise of nationalist voices in the Iranian parliament. In March 1951, Iranian Prime Minister Hajj Ali Razmara was assassinated by an ardent supporter of oil nationalization. Shortly after the assassination, nationalists in the Iranian Majlis, or parliament, nominated Mossadegh as their new prime minister. Fearing the strength of the nationalist movement, the Shah was forced to approve Mossadegh's nomination. And in May 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry. Addressing his victory, Mossadegh said in a famous speech,
"Our long years of negotiations with foreign countries have yielded no results thus far. With the oil revenues, we could meet our entire budget and combat poverty, disease, and backwardness among our people."
The nationalization of Iranian oil was a blow to Britain's economic interests and to the survival of the British Empire.
Views of the great refinery at Abadan are sufficient evidence in themselves of its size and importance. This great undertaking, built up over many years by British skill and with British money, has now been evacuated in humiliating circumstances.
Britain took the matter to the International Court of Justice and placed an embargo on Iran's oil industry, making it impossible for Iran to sell its newly nationalized oil on the world market. The British hoped that economic pressure would threaten the popularity of Mossadegh and force him out of power. But Mossadegh was adamant.
Abroad, that strange politician Dr. Mossadegh continued on his strange way, refusing every offer for settlement of the oil dispute.
Desperate to regain control of Iran's oil industry, the British government approached the United States to assist in orchestrating a coup against Mossadegh. Harry Truman's administration rejected the idea of a coup in 1952, but when Dwight Eisenhower came to power in 1953, the British were able to persuade him by warning him of Mossadegh's communist alliances.
Demonstrations and riots in the streets of Tehran have followed the usual pattern in that troubled country. With shouts of "down with the Shah," fanatical leaders have been rallying the people in favor of Dr. Mossadegh.
The initial plan of toppling Mossadegh had failed, but the British and Americans eventually succeeded when they relied on royalists, the supporters of the exiled Shah. The country was divided between the Shah supporters and Mossadegh supporters. This is how pro-Shah demonstrators took over the streets of Tehran. Mobs set pro-Mossadegh newspapers on fire, General Fazollah Zahedi surrounded Mossadegh's residence with tanks, and protesters clashed with his guards. Mossadegh and his cabinet eventually surrendered, and General Fazollah Zahedi became Iran's new prime minister. The US then restored the pro-Western regime of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power. This was the first foreign intervention orchestrated by the newly formed CIA. The agency, with the help of British MI6, overthrew the first democratically elected government in the country. It was the beginning of the sequence of events that shaped Iran's relations with the US today.
In the military court at Tehran, where he's been on trial for treason, the Persian ex-premier, Dr. Mossadegh, demonstrates that he knows how to make an entrance.
Mossadegh was imprisoned for 3 years, then put under house arrest until his death. His family were forced to bury him at his residence. The overthrow of Mossadegh transformed Iran from a constitutional monarchy into a royal dictatorship, marking the beginning of public hostility towards the US. In 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright acknowledged for the first time the US's role in the 1953 coup.
But the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development, and it is easy to see now why many Iranians continue to resent this intervention by America in their internal affairs.
After the coup of 1953, the oil was back under the control of the British, and the US gave increasing support to the Shah of Iran. In 2013, Iran's parliament approved a bill for the government to sue the US for its involvement in the coup. The bill followed the release of declassified documents offering details about how the CIA carried out the coup as an act of US foreign policy.
Campaign to install a pro-Western government in Iran. Target: Prime Minister Mossadegh and his government. Objectives: through legal or quasi-legal methods, to effect the fall of the Mossadegh government and to replace it with a pro-Western government under the Shah's leadership with Zahedi as its prime minister.
In 1957, the US government helped the Shah establish its infamous secret police force known as Savak. Savak was tasked with monitoring the Shah's political opponents and even Iranians abroad. The agency tortured many Iranians, and its agents received training for interrogation tactics from the CIA. But the alliance between the Shah and the US turned a deaf ear to the growing anger in Iranian streets against the oppression of the Shah and US interference. In late December 1977, during a lavish New Year's Eve celebration, US President Jimmy Carter praised the Shah for making his country an island of stability.
Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world.
Little more than a year later, animosity towards the Shah and US policies culminated in the Shah's ousting. Religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini, who played an integral part in the Shah overthrow, returned to the country after 15 years in exile. His return marked the beginning of more than 4 decades of animosity between Iran and the US. Since 1984, the US has designated Iran as a sponsor of terrorism, and although there were periods of negotiations and decreased tensions, changes in administration and Iran's proxy wars throughout the region have put the two countries at odds once again. Tensions between Tehran and Washington have been rising since the Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018.
For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over.
The US has taken several steps to put maximum pressure on the Iranian regime. The campaign aimed to curb Iran's nuclear program and regional reach by draining its economy. Iran responded to the maximum pressure campaign with a maximum resistance campaign. In retaliation, Iran showed off its ability to harm US interests in the region. In January 2020, the US assassinated Qassem Soleimani, Iran's most revered military commander. Soleimani was the head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. His controversial role in the war in Syria enhanced Iran's military presence in the region. President Hassan Rouhani drew parallels between Soleimani's assassination and the US-engineered coup of 1953.
This crime that the US committed is similar to the coup attempt and similar to the downing of Airbus passenger flight in the Persian Gulf. This crime will never be forgotten.
Trump said that by killing Soleimani, the US had saved many lives, but to many of these mourners, Soleimani, just like Mossadegh, was another national hero that the US removed from power against the will of the Iranian people.